Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is probably going to be a pretty short video, and that is because it's very difficult to actually come up with all of the things to talk about with regard to Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the end of the world. Sometimes you just have an experience with a book that is so impactful and in some ways that you just can't actually look at it and piece together all the reasons why you like it or even dislike it in some cases. In this case, very much more so the former. But I'm going to try my absolute best to cover this book because what an experience this book was for me. I'm ashamed it's taken me technically this long to actually review this. It's been a few months since I actually read it, but alas, I had so many video slots and ironically enough, so many ideas of things that I wanted to talk about or needed to talk about sooner that this just kind of fell by the wayside for a couple of months when I otherwise really would have liked to review it. But we're here talking about it now, and the introduction to this video is garbage. I'm so sorry. What I should say is, let's talk about this book as best as I can, starting off with the good like I normally do. The problem is that talking about the good of Hard-Boiled Wonderland for me is very difficult to do, kind of like what I was getting into so far. Put quite simply, this is my book of the year so far, and it is my book of the year so far in no small part because I actually have a hard time actually quantifying why I like it so much. Like I was kind of saying in the introduction, sometimes you just have an experience with a book that impacts you so much that you actually have a hard time actually really determining what it is that clicked and what it is that might not click for some other people. I do my best to review books in such a manner that I'm being pretty objective about them, right? I try my best. Sometimes that doesn't work. If you've seen some of my McCarthy videos, I'm less good about being objective with him because I just don't like his writing. But there are some of his books that I do love in spite of that, so, forgive me for that. But in any case, there are some reviews that have been a little bit less successful on my part in being objective or trying to be objective. There are some books that I feel like I've done a very good job of being objective about in spite of some amount of connection that I have with them, including books that I've worked on to one degree or another, where I can separate myself from that body of work in such a way that's like, you know what, here's the qualitative aspects of this body of work, here's my experience with them. Here are some things that might bother some people, even though they didn't bother me. Here are some things that some people might like, even though I had a problem with them, right? Like, I try to approach books as offhand and objective as I possibly can. I find that very difficult to do with Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World, and that is because everything about this book clicked with me. There are some notable aspects of the book that I can get into here with the good and talk about, and things that, like I said, are notable that I liked about it. Some of those things are the dual storyline. I think that the way that Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World deals with having two different worlds, two different protagonists, and those storylines associated with those worlds and protagonists being basically unrelated for the majority of the book, but the way that they converge and relate to each other in the end is so masterfully handled that it's one of those trust the process kind of journeys that was really, really, really good, something that not very many people are able to pull off, and I think that was pulled off as perfectly as it is possible to be able to pull it off in this book. So that's something that I think is really solid. With regard to that dual world, two different protagonists, two different worlds, all that kind of stuff. There's also a lot of genre fusion in this book that I think is incredible. There's a little bit of magical realism that mixes into this, but, one of those worlds has a lot more of a fantasy flair to it. And one of those worlds has a lot more of a sci-fi flair to it, and there's also a lot of other genre fusion stuff that is happening in here. There are moments that kind of border on the edge of horror. There are a couple moments that are, a little bit different, right? But the general, I would say, the sci-fi and fantasy fusion happening in here between the couple of storylines, and again, how those things converge is really cool. But there's a lot of stuff with regard to that fusion that is really solid, that you would not believe that this many different ideas and influences would manage to yield a book that is as solid as this is. but somehow Murakami manages to do it. There's also a matter of like not just the genre fusion, but also like the tonal and stylistic fusion. Like one of those worlds, like I said, is a little bit more fantasy-esque, but the more sci-fi world is basically like our world, but it's like a futuristic world, but that also has a very 90s aesthetic to it at the same time. Like there's just a lot of different like little things about what makes this book what it is, and what makes the story what it is, and what makes the worlds what they are. Just all of these different things that piece together that create a conglomerate whole that somehow manages to be perfect in ways that like are really hard to describe objectively. It's like if you're somebody who doesn't like sci-fi, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to dislike this book. If you don't like fantasy, you're not necessarily going to dislike this book. If you don't like magical realism, you're not necessarily going to dislike this book, because the magical realism stuff is part of what makes the genre fusion actually all click into place together. And the magical realism is also really like subtle. Like it's not like a Latin American magical realism where like just absolutely absurd and crazy stuff is happening in an otherwise realistic world. Like no, it's like little things. There are aspects that are like, oh, this is basically a fantasy element, but if you look at it from a certain perspective, it's actually just magical realism. Or some things that are more magical realism in one setting but are straight up fantasy in another exist in this book, and the way that they exist mean that it's like kind of molding everything together. I know this description is not really selling anything to you, and it's also not really describing anything very effectively. I know that, I'm aware, and I apologize about that, but it just kind of goes to my point of like, everything about the book clicked together for me in such a way that I have a hard time really distinguishing what that thing actually is that clicked, right? So that's part of the problem. There are some other things about the book that I liked a little bit more objectively speaking, things such as the characterization of most of the characters. None of the characters in this book have names, for example, but you're never having a hard time distinguishing them because they are so distinct from one another. That's something that I think some authors would very much struggle with, is characters not actually having proper noun names associated with them. Being able to go through an entire book that's 400 pages and furthermore has two worlds, two main characters, technically two storylines going on, and managing to keep that up as well. But it never feels off. It never feels like it's underdoing anything. It also never feels like it's overdoing anything. And you somehow don't ever feel like anything's being super repetitive on account of that, lack of character names. Like you would think that would be something that you would latch onto and notice and be really bothered by. I didn't even notice that there were no proper noun names until like 2/3 of the way through the book. And I was like, wait a minute. Have any of these characters actually had names? And no, they don't. That's something that you would think would be really bothersome, and maybe it will be bothersome for some people, so I guess that's something that I could put into the bad, but like none of it was anything that I ever latched onto or noted as anything that I found bad or in a way that I think would be bad for other people. Part of the reason why all of these things are able to click together in such a way that worked so well for me is because there's also a general subtlety to the way that Murakami handles the book and the overall product that is genuinely breathtaking. Like every topic, every idea, every character, every little element that is part of this book manages to reflect upon all the others, or is used in some way that is like reminiscent of something important. Like every moment of the book is engaging because there is not a single element of the book that feels out of place somehow, despite them being so eclectic and otherwise seemingly random. It is just such a crazy way that this manages to work. And even though there are two worlds, two main characters, two storylines going on, and even though those storylines alternate literally every chapter, you never get lost with any of it, not even a little bit. And like that is definitely something to commend about the book. But what it comes down to with regard to like my thesis of the good is I loved this. I think this book is basically perfect. Everything that somebody could bring up as being an element of this book, just about everything that somebody could bring up as an element of the book, I would be able to like reflect on that and be like, no, that's good for the totality of the book for this reason. That is how much everything clicked into place for me. But it is one of those personal things where reviewing this book for you guys, that's a very unobjective way to qualify it. You know, I can talk about a book that I loved, but also be able to acknowledge that it's not going to work for everybody. Like Perfume by Patrick Zuskind, which I have not reviewed up to this point yet. It will be a review on the channel at some point this year. I love that book, but I can also say, like, that book's not going to click for everybody. Objectively speaking, I can say this book's not going to click for everybody. I know that, but I had an experience with it that makes it basically impossible for me to look at it and understand how it doesn't click for everybody. That is the type of thing that I'm talking about here. It is crazy just how good of an experience I had with it. And sure, part of that is also, you know, due to the fact that the time that I read this in late January was a time when I really, really needed escapism. And this was just a brilliant escapist piece of media in a way that, like, most other books basically aren't. You know, I put myself into the roles of basically all the characters of the books that I read in some sense. So reading is a very, like, mentally intensive and sometimes exhausting and sometimes very emotional journey for me in a lot of ways and at a lot of points because of that habit that I have while reading. But this was a book where, like, being in that world was, like, rejuvenating and really exciting and breathtaking, rather than it being like any of the other books that I tend to read, where it tends to be like being a transport into, you know, it is still escapist, like it is still transporting into something, but it's not like as breathtaking and beautiful as Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World was usually. So that's how I feel about that. It was a brilliant piece of escapist media when I needed that the most. With regard to the bad, I guess I could point out some of those things like I said before. You know, the fact that you know, there are no names for any of the characters. That might be something that some people manage to latch onto and really dislike. The multiple worlds, the genre fusion, the eclectic nature of so many things going on. Some of these things are probably going to not work for some people, and there are probably going to be people who feel like they should like it but think that it's just too much all at once and it's hard to really actually connect with as a result. I think that some of those takes would be like valid and fair, obviously. I'm not going to try to discount anybody's opinion on that front, but like I said before, it just happens to be the case that my experience with this book was such that I actually, for once, as a rarity, it's a rarity for this to happen, but I legitimately struggle to, like, actually, you know, empathetically, quote unquote, understand why somebody would come to those conclusions, because that is how perfectly things clicked into place for me. This isn't just my book of the year. It is really high up on my all-time favorites. That is how good it is. So for me to talk about some of these things as the bad feels like dishonest to myself and my own experience, even though I'm trying to say, like, you know, your mileage may vary in terms of your reaction with literally any of the things that could be brought up as things I liked, but I liked literally everything about it, so I don't know. All that said, however, moving on into the ugly, there is actually technically one thing that I could put into the bad, but because it fits topically into something that I do tend to kind of put into the ugly, I will put it here. You know, some authors don't handle writing women particularly well, and Murakami's handling of women in his writing is a particular hot button issue. There are plenty of people out there who really, really hate the way that he writes women, and there is one particular character in this book, I mean, women in general, but like one particular character in this book, the Pink Lady, is definitely something. I totally get the issues that people have with not just the character, but the way the character is written about, even though the way the character is written about comes from the first person narration in a way that I think is actually intellectually honest and isn't a problem in my personal take. But there are going to be people, you know, that are really, really bothered by this. I know people who have been really, really bothered by this. I know people who really love this book in spite of that issue, whereas I'm like, I really love this book and it just wasn't an issue for me, right? So Murakami's handling of women and also of quote-unquote romance, those types of proclivities in general, seem to be something that is fairly normally criticized amongst his work as a whole. And in that sense, I suppose Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World isn't necessarily free from that criticism. Like I said, that one particular character is definitely something, but I think that if you're going to go into this book, that just don't read too much into it, and like you're probably not going to have a problem. And if you do have a problem with it, fair enough, I don't blame you, but you know, I'll make you aware of that fact. You know, don't read a Murakami book without knowing the criticisms that come up against his female characters or anything like that. So that is something that I will put out there. But again, even in this case for me, it's something that just didn't really bother me. So yeah, that's how I feel. As regards to a recommendation, kind of similar to the way that it's hard to review this book objectively because I just struggle to actually come at it from that angle compared to basically any other book I've read, giving you an honest recommendation of Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World, that title is a mouthful, is kind of difficult actually. I will say, as a general matter, I do think that you should give this a shot, if only because I loved it so much, so there's a little bit of selfishness in that. But I do have to tell you, I in no way guarantee that everybody will like this, because I think that many will hate it. Obviously, that's just how art works, but the reasons why I think people will hate this are reasons that I cannot give. They're reasons that I just don't have off the top of my head necessarily, because there's nothing that stuck out to me in that way outside of, you know, the potential women criticism, right? But because I loved this so much, I can't just tell you, you know, give this a shot if you want to or whatever, because like, I think you should give it a shot. Like, I really want people to read this. I think people should try it, you know, trust the process with it. If you nope out because of the pink lady, I get it. If you nope out because just all the stuff going on is like, it's too much, because it's too many little things, too much of a genre fusion, whatever, like, I can understand, really. Like, I understand why some people would make those decisions, but because of how much I loved this, and how much I genuinely struggled to fathom a less perfect book for my experience that I had with it, I recommend this because I think people should try it. Like I said, I don't guarantee you'll love it, but I basically have to recommend it just because of how much I loved it. And also because of how much I wasn't necessarily sure I would love it. You know, in order to like close out this review, basically, Murakami is one of my personal friends' favorite authors. And this was the book that was basically given to me as probably the best place for me to start. And really, that friend, Reen, hello, I know you're watching this video. Reen was not sure where I would fall with this book. Normally with the books that he recommends to me, or the books that I try on his accord, you know, things that he talks about that I'm like, you know, I want to give that a shot because of the way you talk about it. He's very good at pitching books to me, tailored to my experiences, basically. Like, he knows how I fall on certain types of books and has a pretty good idea probably where I'll fall. You know, I surprise him with some things at some times, and we don't necessarily agree on all of the things that we like. Like Wheel of Time, for example, we have many disagreements on the things that we do or don't like about that series, just, you know, as one thing. But he is very good at taking my preferences, my tastes into account when making recommendations. And when recommending Murakami, or when, you know, I was expressing this interest to read Murakami because of how much he liked Murakami, he was like, you should probably start with Hard-Boiled Wonderland. That'll probably be the best place for you to start, but I really don't know if you're going to like it. That is what he told me. Like, he said this multiple times. He was a little bit afraid to get my opinion on it, basically. Was not sure where I would fall. Most of the other books that he recommends to me are books that he's pretty sure I will enjoy. This one, he had no clue. And it's one of my favorite books of all time now. So, like, that's really, really cool. But that means that it's very difficult for me to recommend it in that way. So, you know, I've undoubtedly overrated Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World in this video, just on account of my ceaseless and, like, basically definitionless ravings about it. But, like, I just can't say anything less about this book than I genuinely really loved it. I think this thing is like perfect. You know, it was tied for my book of the month in January with another book, and at the time I was saying like it's going to be almost certainly one of the top 2 spots on my book of the year list with it. And as the last couple months have passed since I read the book, I think I'm pretty comfortable saying that this just straight up is my book of the year right now, and I struggle to see any other book overtaking it just because of how much I loved it. And yeah, like that alone should tell you just how much I liked it, but I struggle to actually convey that in a way that is useful for you in a recommendation sense. So I apologize for a very low quality review, but I hope you got something out of it anyway. I hope you enjoyed the video. For now, I'm just going to try to stop rambling and like get out of your face. I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, which will surely be a little bit more sensible than this one is.